I've been hungry before. I understand how it can make a person or an animal do unnatural things. I don't mean skipped breakfast hungry either. I mean starving. The thing I saw was also starving. There's no other justification for why it would have attacked me. I just wish I was aware of what it was. I wish I had a moniker for the thing, a designation to provide it any time this narrative arises. I was employed by a security company at the time. We were contracted by businesses to safeguard properties during times of ownership changes or refurbishment tasks. In this specific scenario, we were supervising an old 3-story school building. It wasn't as big as one might envision. There was only one main building, no wings or hallways. When it was built, they must have just stacked the kids on top of one another. One floor for a certain age range, each following floor for the next group. It served its purpose at the time, I am sure. But when I set foot on the property, that purpose had come and gone. The brick was covered in graffiti. The windows were either broken or boarded up. You have seen those types of buildings, correct? They are covered in the dirt of history. It's simple to visualize all kinds of unpleasant individuals and beasts squatting within those walls. For me, that implied rats. That was my greatest fear at that moment. I could persuade a squatter to leave the property, but an infestation of rats was a completely different story. Because of this, I did my best to remain outside of the building when it was my turn to patrol. I thought that if I secured the perimeter enough, there wouldn't be any motive to cross through the old metal doors and venture into the decaying school building. Those thoughts were ended the instant I heard something creating noise inside. A dull clatter echoed through the emptiness, reminiscent of a pot being tossed about within a cabinet. Certainly it was much too loud to be the work of rats, I pondered. In hindsight, I would have much preferred if it had been rats. As I stepped inside the looming darkness, my flashlight's beam sliced through it, providing a modicum of visibility. The interior was in a predictable state of disorder. It was simple to understand why the company employing our services was keen to have the building torn down. While the overall structural integrity was tolerable, some of the interior walls and floors had decayed. The gaps appeared like broad open mouths developing in the tender wood, forming entrances where none had existed before. I couldn't help but consider how greatly that compromised my usual routine. If there were passageways like this, rotted out on the inside, who knew how many non-traditional entrances had cropped up along the exterior? Something easily could have snuck in through a hole in the wall while my eyes were checking the doors and windows. Of course, I couldn't have predicted what really did sneak in, and I cannot say now how long it had been there. Perhaps it was inside the entire time and had avoided detection by sticking to the niches and hidden spaces that my peers and I overlooked. After all, no one had informed us how to search for the unexplainable. I was in search of a man or a dog, one of the usual intruders. However, it found me before I found it. I felt its teeth sinking into my shoulder, shredding through 3 layers of polyester as if they weren't even there. When I whipped around and threw it off, instinctively reaching for my sidearm, I froze. A dog is the closest thing I can compare it to, I suppose. A sick dog with rippling muscles and not a single patch of hair. Its claws cut into the tiled floor as it skidded to a halt. Its face was shaped like a greyhound's, long and narrow and built for speed. Its teeth hung out. They were too long for its jaws, and its tongue moved back and forth as it gasped for air. There were sharp points on that tongue. They appeared like bone-colored thorns, yellowish-white in color and forming out of the soft tissue, like little pointed teeth emerging from the muscle. I pondered, was that what sliced my shoulder? I am still uncertain. The thought itself was sufficient to compel me to retch. I fought to keep down the contents of my stomach and fired my gun. It was a wild shot that echoed all through the building. It missed, but it was enough to send the creature running. The moment it turned around, I buckled. I heaved my breakfast out and onto my shoes. It felt like my skin was crawling. I was already imagining all the diseases that could have crept into my bloodstream. The last thing I wanted was the germs from that tongue swimming around in my body. I left my post and headed straight to the hospital. They gave me the all clear and assured me that the rash that appeared on my body afterward was unrelated to the attack. They gave me a few shots, routine in animal attacks, just to be on the safe side. But that brings me to the reason this story never leaves my mind. There's a physical reason why people inquire me about it. It's because the scars I bear from that night have not disappeared at all. The puncture marks on my body are now concealed by a silvery pale tissue. However, until today, the rash has not disappeared. It appears on my shoulder every few months, spreading a little more across my body each time. Various theories have been proposed to me, ranging from allergies to eczema, none of which I had prior to the attack. I am concerned. It could be something worse, could it not? Recently, when the rash appears, my tongue begins to itch. What do you think that signifies? What do you think infected me that day? The doctors are of no help, and now it is up to me to figure it out. I am hoping you can help. I have an unusual story to share with you. I adore the outdoors. I enjoy hiking and backpacking. Over the years, I've encountered quite a number of wildlife species, and occasionally a strange individual or two. However, what occurred on this day is entirely different. In fact, I am still uncertain of my thoughts about it. It took place previous June, and I have not spoken about it since. I work as a science teacher at a high school, hence I have my summers off. That summer, I was on a solo 2-week backpacking trip through the Cascades. It is an area I have frequented for years. I try to get out there as much as possible. I had taken a different trail than normal that time. There is no specific reason for my detour. I suppose I was merely seeking to discover new regions. A few days into my journey, I stumbled upon this ancient, deserted camping area. There are not many camping areas this far out. Most people follow the leave no trace principles. So discovering someone's campsite is quite exceptionally rare. There were a few items scattered around. An old pot rusting near a stone circle that had once been used as a campfire, an old and faded canvas tent that had collapsed on one side, and a moldy backpack. I spent time examining the area. It didn't make sense for hikers to leave their tent and backpack behind. I was getting worried that I might have stumbled upon the last known location of a missing camper. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started rummaging around the site. The tent was old, like those canvas things that people used before you could buy an ultra-lightweight, space-saving, self-pitching style at the local sports retailer. That gnarly thing looked like it could stand up to a hurricane. Bearing my weight on it, I propped it up, and a cloud of dust kicked up from the ordeal, which made me curse and wave my hat around in a desperate quest for fresh air. The rucksack was absolutely fascinating. Inside it, I discovered a bag of what used to be trail mix, but now overtaken by some sort of small creature. At the same moment, just as the sun was reaching its zenith, I experienced this strange sensation. It was difficult to describe, almost like someone or something was observing me. Now, I have spent sufficient time hiking to understand that sometimes you're not solitary in the wilderness. It might be animals or fellow hikers, but this sensation felt distinct. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was a sensation I had not felt in a long time. Bear in mind, I had not seen or heard a soul for days, which was no surprise out here. The wilderness does frequently remind you just how tiny your piece of existence is. However, something was terribly wrong here, and it was not only that deserted camping area. Then suddenly I heard a noise that I will never forget. It was a profound puff, succeeded by a low, reverberating grumble. It reverbed through the trees, causing the foliage to shake and birds to dart away in fear. At first I thought it was a bear, and I can tell you for certain that I wouldn't want to encounter a bear so close on a trail, but as I would soon find out, there are creatures more terrifying than bears out there in the wild. Suddenly, the earth vibrated beneath me, like I was standing next to a large stampeding animal. Turning on my heels, I stepped backward in shock as the colossal figure burst into view. Its massive shape overshadowed the open area behind it. It must have been close to 9 feet tall. Its physique was sturdy. Thick, rough hair covered all parts of its body, excluding the face and hands. The hair was a shimmering reddish hue as the sun rays hit it. I am a big man myself, but this creature made me look pitifully small. And boy, the smell. A rancid, putrid odor crept over me, thick and heavy. Its face was what truly accelerated my heartbeat. Broad cheekbones transformed into a prominent forehead, culminating in deep-set eyes as dark as midnight. Its expansive nostrils flared, producing that unnerving huffing noise again. It appeared to be a hybrid between a human and an ape, like some sort of missing link of human evolution, but much, much larger. It bared its teeth at me. I do not know if it was simply showing its strength or if it was a direct threat. Shaking from the sight, I found myself instinctively crawling back toward my camp gear. My safely propped-up tent now looked like a flimsy sanctuary in the face of this hulking beast. The growl repeated louder this time, rolling through the campsite like a thunder crack and making me stumble over the worn tent ropes as I backed away. With a loud snarl, it took a step forward. Despite all its weight, the creature was surprisingly light on its feet. I did not stick around to marvel at its next move. Collecting my senses, I dashed off. Moving through the dense thicket beyond ancient oaks, I sprinted until my lungs were on fire, and then I continued to race. At last, I was beneath the guarded shelter of a newly concealed campsite, but I still stayed up the entire night. I'm uncertain of how I successfully dodged that beast, but in some way I accomplished it. And I can tell you, though, that I never went back there. I'm not sure what happened to the people from that abandoned campsite, but I do not imagine anything good came to them if they met that creature like I did. The encounter left a profound impact on me, leaving me questioning my brave solo hiking trips. I cannot settle in the wilderness the way I used to before I knew of the creature's existence. This is not a story I wanted to share, but I think individuals should be aware that there are real live monsters out there. If you are planning to spend time in solitude in the wilderness, it is of utmost importance to be prudent and ready for any possible situation. I was a volunteer for search and rescue in my local area. Living near a well-liked hiking locale on the eastern fringe of the Rocky Mountains meant that we regularly encountered hikers from outside of Kentucky who were significantly ill-equipped for the challenges of mountain weather and terrain. Usually we would locate the individual and ensure their safe return home. However, our region boasts some pretty hazardous wildlife. While these creatures don't typically target humans, they can quickly consume a human body in the event of an accident. For instance, if a person were to tumble down a rocky slope and break a leg, they could be perceived as an easy prey for a bear. Within a handful of days, no trace of the person would be left. There is absolutely no trace at all. Suppose someone disappears in this area and we are unable to locate them. It's likely due to the wildlife finding them before we could, or that's what I've always been informed. I'm uncertain what to believe now. My revelation originates from a period when we encountered 3 hikers, all disappearing without any trace around the same region. They were individual instances with no link between them and occurred several weeks apart. I participated in the search team on horseback. The preference for us being on horseback was because we were capable of covering a larger area and managing rough terrain much easier compared to walking. Many of us riders in this area engage in this activity on a volunteer basis, simply as something to occupy our time. However, that detail isn't crucial to the narrative. I got deeply familiar with the locale after being involved in 3 extensive search missions in that season. The missing hikers were all supposed to be possible victims of wildlife. There was a vast cave system in close proximity, and the police were certain that we were dealing with a bear living in the region that was predatory in nature. Even though they couldn't locate it, I wasn't convinced. I had a strong friendship with a high-ranking officer from Fish and Wildlife. He informed me that bears don't usually reside in caves. Indeed, no large predators do. Sometimes they will take up a temporary residence in a cave, but even when searching for hibernation spots, bears tend to burrow in a side hill. He did not think we were dealing with a bear. Something might live in those caves, he said, but it is not a bear. We organized the team to do one last search around the caves before officially calling it off. I remember it well. There was no sign of the missing hiker or any of the missing hikers for that matter. But we did the search anyway. We organized in grids so we would not be overlapping. My section of the grid was the one nearest to the caves, but I was not concerned. I was on horseback and I was carrying a sidearm in the event I ran into any combative wildlife. My horse never much liked that area, but we had been over there so many times that year I thought she was finally getting used to it. That evening she was tense. She wasn't visibly uneasy, but I sensed she felt something was amiss. Looking back, I should have paid heed to her. It was approximately at twilight when we were leaving that I detected some noise from one of the caves as we were walking past. It sounded like someone threw a rock down the cave, but I did not see anything. I asked, "Who is there?" but received no response. A moment later, in the darkness of the cave, I saw two eyes emerge. My first thought was bear or mountain lion, so I grabbed my gun and pointed it at the mouth of the cave. I told whatever it was to stay in there, not expecting it could understand me, but oftentimes if wild animals hear humans, they will steer clear. But if this really was the rogue predatory bear that was killing these hikers, I was likely in trouble. My horse was fidgety and nervous now, and I could not blame her. I could tell she wanted to bolt and run, but I did not want the creature in the cave to chase us if it did not already have a mind to. It blinked at us in the darkness and slowly emerged from its rocky home. What I saw at the mouth of the cave left me speechless. I expected to see some kind of animal, something covered in fur, but this was far from that. It looked like a little human, almost ghoul-like. It was bald and pale as the moonlight shining above. Its limbs were thin and seemed excessively long for its body. Its legs had odd bends to them. It was as if they were a twist between human legs and those of a dog. The creature moved in a clumsy manner, but I speculate that if it wished to run, it could move incredibly quickly with those back legs. Its face was the worst part. I mean, seriously, I cannot even properly describe it to you. It was like looking at a skull. Imagine it. Its nose was just two slits on its face, and those eyes, oh man, those dark eyes took up just about its entire head. The way it stared at me sent chills down my spine. It looked like some sort of demon, something out of a horror film. It hissed at me when it saw me, and I'm not ashamed to admit I was scared out of my wits. Without thinking, I took a shot at it, but who knows if it hit? I mean, the creature retreated back into the cave so quickly I could not tell if the shot landed or not. There was no way I was sticking around to see if it was going to come back out. I was out of there like a bat out of hell. Once I got back to my truck, my hands were still shaking, and I called up my friend from Fish and Wildlife. I informed him directly that I observed something in the cave just a while ago, and it was not a bear. I anticipated him to laugh or craft some jest. However, his response was quite enigmatic. He enlightened me regarding the unresolved disappearance cases close to vast cave systems and the rampant conjecture regarding their connection, assuming there exists one. The manner in which he spoke about it was quite chilling, I assure you. He mentioned that the police did not know about it, but most park rangers did. He even said that half the time they are sent out to dispatch a dangerous bear, it turns out to be something else entirely. Something that is not a bear at all. I could tell he was serious, and he told me to go home, assuring me that he will take care of it. And that was that. It was like an unspoken agreement between us to never talk about it again. But I will admit it is something that's haunted me ever since. Every time I drive by that area or hear about another missing person, I cannot help but think about that creature and what it might really be. It's one of those things, you know. The more you think about it, the more it gets to you. It's left me with more questions than answers. What was that thing? Why did my friend from Fish and Wildlife appear to be informed about it? And why do they refrain from informing the police? However, I assume certain matters are better left undiscovered. All I understand is I'll forever perceive caves and wild animals differently. I still have dreams about those dark, soulless eyes staring at me from the shadows of that cave. It's an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone and something I'll never forget. No way, no how. I have got a wild story from the time when I was working as a park ranger in Alaska. The wilderness there is almost impossible to describe. Just miles and miles of pristine beauty completely untouched by man. The summer months are amazing, but when winter comes around, it can get brutal. The cold there reaches inside you and touches your bones. At the time, I was working in this isolated station, which was a good 2-day trek from civilization. Such isolation can take its toll on some people, but I always found the solitude comforting. It was midwinter and the entire landscape was veiled in a blanket of fresh snow. As stunning as it was, every creature had to work 2 times as hard for survival, including me. Part of my daily duties involved monitoring trap lines set up in the area. In addition to the cold, overcoming the rugged terrain was just as pitiless under all this snow. These traps were distributed over a good stretch, requiring me to traverse dense forests that teemed with all kinds of wild animals. Evidence of animal activity was quite frequent: claw marks on tree trunks, flattened shrubs, and even an occasional carcass here or there. It was the reality of wilderness, raw and unfiltered. I remember that morning like it was yesterday. It was absolutely frigid and frost covered the windows of my truck. I set out on my usual route, but it was not long before things took a strange turn. I noticed certain irregularities that I ended up shrugging off as odd coincidences. When you get that far out in the woods, the lines between the rational and the irrational blur more often than you would think, especially when dealing with extreme weather. But I persist, eager to return to the warmth of the station. I was halfway through my patrols when I found a trap that was not just activated, but torn to pieces. Most of these were traps for bears. They are pretty darn sturdy contraptions. I had never seen anything like it before. The steel jaws were torn apart like they were made of paper. There were scratches on the ground and signs of struggle, but nothing that indicated the catch had freed itself. I conducted a rapid assessment of the environment and was immediately assaulted by a foul odor. It was the undoubted aroma of decaying flesh, and it was becoming stronger with each fleeting moment. It was certainly spoiled, and not a smell I would anticipate finding in a corpse at these temperatures. Anything that had been deceased for a lengthy period would be frozen in this location. There was something else in the air, too. I couldn't identify what it was, but it felt as if the atmosphere suddenly became heavy, even oppressive. Retreating from the disturbing smell and that peculiar sensation, I tried to regain my composure. As the day progressed, the sickening scent persisted and seemed to intensify. You have smelled a carcass before, sure, but this was distinctly quite vile. It was similar to death and decay being stewed over a slow fire. Now, I am not one to scare easily, but I can tell you that the woods felt off that day. The usual rustling of leaves was subdued, the common calls and melodious chirping eerily absent, as though every creature was holding its breath. The tall trees cast long dark shadows that seemed to be hiding things far more sinister. I trudged through the heavy snow. The crunch of my boots was the only sound defying the silence. I felt an uneasiness creep up my spine. Something felt very, very wrong. The raw wilderness that I had come to appreciate over my years of service suddenly seemed menacing, but I pressed on. I wanted to get this job done as quickly as possible so I could get back to the station. As I continued, I began noticing unusual claw marks on the trees around me and strange tracks. They were twisted hoof-like prints mixed with the semblance of a human foot. I've seen deer tracks and bear tracks, but nothing like this. It was way bigger than anything I was familiar with. Strange sounds filled the air, so incoherent yet deeply unsettling. Every rustle of leaves and snapping of twigs began to paint terrifying images in my mind. I attempted to attribute it to my own fear and excess imagination. But then, I started to feel like someone or something was observing me. I started to see warped glimpses of motions in the trees from my peripheral vision. I stood frozen for a moment, fighting the urge to flee. I knew I was engaging with something beyond my comprehension. It was an ancient evil that I thought resided only in nearly forgotten folk stories. My fear battled fervently with my sense of responsibility, and the former was victorious. I decided the best course of action would be to report these findings and return to the station. I didn't need to see the creature to know what made those tracks was not natural. It was not any creature I had encountered before in my line of work. This was something else. The forest was not the same. It felt like a hollow echo chamber for my fears, feeding on my insecurity and amplifying it back at me. I had heard enough old stories to know what makes hooves, tracks, and smells of rotten flesh. I will not say the name, but I am sure you can figure it out. The folk around here claim that speaking the word aloud calls it to you. I still work out there in the wild, and I don't want any trouble with this thing. Never ever in my life have I felt such an overpowering sense of dread as I did that day. That encounter and the lingering uncertainty altered my perception of the pristine Alaskan wilderness forever. Some things, I think, are better left alone. But remember, if you ever find yourself alone in the Alaskan wilderness, make sure you keep your wits about you. If you think something is watching you, you are probably right. This one night at Caddo Lake, it's a story that still leaves me puzzled. It started as a quiet night, just me, the water, my fishing gear, and a cooler full of icy beer. This happened under a dark Texas sky where the stars were brighter than anywhere else I had ever experienced. To be honest, it felt almost spiritual. The solitude and quiet, with the lake's surface reflecting the sky. It was deep into the summer and too muggy for a normal day of fishing. But under the cool night sky, it was perfect. Night fishing is different. You rely more on your senses than sight. Every little nibble on the line, every whisper of the wind could be a catch. I remember sitting there on my old boat, idling in the calm water. I watched my float bob gently along with the current, beer chilling in one hand while my other hand was ever ready on my fishing rod. Nocturnal creatures buzzed softly in the background. The lake, usually busy with activity during the day, was now eerily silent, as if in a deep, unending sleep. It was peaceful, a much-needed escape from the daily grind. That's when things began to take a strange turn. It was around 12 a.m., and I had already reeled in a few good catches. Just as I cast my line again, something caught my eye from the corner of my vision, an odd, faint metallic glint from the water. The moon, though hidden behind clouds, was casting just enough light for the strange shimmer to be noticeable. I narrowed my eyes, making an effort to identify what was causing that. Stories that I had encountered about Caddo Lake came into my thoughts. Even though I am not one to believe in superstitions, something seemed unusual. My intuition was alerting me that something was not correct. Pushing the thought aside, I shifted my focus back to my fishing line, holding my fishing rod a bit more firmly. Then, an event unfolded. I might have pinned it on the beer, yet I was absolutely unimpaired. A splash resonating more than any fish or beaver navigating through the water reverberated across the lake. And suddenly the quiet of the night was not so soothing anymore. From the edge of my sight, I saw this dark figure contrasting the night sky on the twisted branch of a nearby tree. I slightly turned my head, not wishing to startle whatever it was, hoping it was just a large horned owl or something similar. But what looked back at me, mirrored in the lake's waters, were two large, glowing red eyes. It was like staring at bright stoplights in the dark water. They glowed like embers, larger than any eyes I had seen in the woods. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to make sense of the sight. A large winged figure about 5 feet tall perched on the branch, its body almost human-like, but its giant leathery wings similar to that of a bat. Its presence made the peaceful surroundings feel unsettling. The once quiet hum of the night now felt eerie. I had heard of the Caddo Lake booger, but this was not it. This winged creature reminded me of the urban legends like the Mothman that frightened many. I began to understand the fear in those whispered legends. I gasped as it suddenly stretched its wings to their full length. It felt like time had slowed down as I watched the creature take flight, those fiery red eyes holding my gaze for a second longer before it shot up into the sky. Suddenly I was alone again. The creature was gone, but its blazing eyes were imprinted on my eyelids. The night felt heavier and more silent than before. I sat there gripping my fishing rod, unease replacing the earlier calm. Finally, I snapped to and packed up my gear. Casting a final glance at the deserted tree branch silhouetted against the ebony nocturnal expanse, I took my leave from the lake. What used to be a refuge of tranquility had been sullied by an eerie encounter. I acknowledge that it's challenging to lend credence to such a tale. Yet I give my word, this transpired. Every time I see those glimmering stars against the night sky or catch a slight glint on a reflecting water surface, I am back at that lake, the fiery red eyes of the Mothman piercing through my mind and soul.